The first rune I held was warm, and it beat like a heart. That was not the disturbing part. My name is unimportant. The Golden Order would strike it from the records even if I told you. What matters is this. I have seen the great runes, all of them that remain in this fractured age. I have touched their edges, inhaled their strange breath, and carried their whispers in my blood. I write this in a study that no longer exists on any map, deep beneath Laendel's oldest vaults. The stone here remembers things the rest of the city has tried to forget. The air is dry, tasting faintly of copper. Parchment curls on the desk before me, edges browned by heat that has no source. I can hear faint singing beyond the western wall. Not a voice, not entirely. Something between a hymn and the sound of metal cooling in a forge. It comes in pulses, and with every pulse, the candlelight dims. I was first sent to catalogue the known great runes for a private patron within the Order's upper echelons. The commission was irregular. We archivists are rarely dispatched beyond the walls, but the payment offered was not coin, not grace, but knowledge. The complete, unredacted record of the demigod's fall. The sanctioned ledger lists 7 great runes, each tied to a shard-bearer of the Elden Ring. And yet, on my second day in this archive, I found mention of an 8th. The ink was not ink. It shimmered, refracting light into shapes I did not recognize. The page said only, "Do not number the rune that bleeds." It was never whole. No diagrams, no bearer's name. Only an addendum, scratched hastily in a script I recognized from confiscated heretical texts. Seal it beneath stone. Do not speak to it. Do not look at it. Do not listen if it calls. The next night, I broke the seal. The vault door was a slab of black granite, ringed with prayer scars, where gold leaf had been hammered into the surface and worn away. The mechanism responded not to key or incantation, but to the touch of my palm. I felt the granite pulse beneath my skin, slow, deliberate, like the beating of a great animal's heart. Inside was no reliquary, no altar, only the rune itself, set into the floor as if it had fallen there from a great height. It was unlike any glyph I had studied. Its lines were jagged, unfinished, as though it had been wrenched apart mid-carving. And yes, it bled. Dark arterial fluid seeped from its edges, spreading into the cracks of the stone. The blood did not pool. It vanished into the floor without trace, yet the smell of it thickened the air, rich, metallic, and sweet. I knelt, tracing the outer edge with a gloved hand. The moment my finger brushed it, heat flared up my arm, and my heart stuttered to match its rhythm. My ears filled with a low hum, like the drone of distant bees, and under that hum I heard words, not in the common tongue, not in any academy lexicon. They were not meant to be heard with ears. The first message I understood was a sensation, not a phrase, incompleteness, a hunger to be whole. I withdrew, trembling, but I could not break the connection. My pulse now beat in synchrony with the runes. I knew, in the way one knows the inevitability of falling once the cliff gives way, that it recognized me. Not my face, not my name, but me, the shape of my existence. I staggered back to my chambers, sealing the vault as before. The singing in the walls had grown louder, more defined, several voices now, weaving a slow chant. The candle light in my study swelled and ebbed with each syllable. I have studied the sanctioned runes for years. Each bears the will and essence of its demigod, and each retains a fragment of the Elden Ring's lost totality. They are inert without a bearer's will to channel them. This thing was different. It did not wait for a bearer. It was the bearer. And worse, I could feel it seeking others of its kind. The Golden Order has many proverbs, but one I always found peculiar came to mind that night. The body seeks its missing limb, though the limb be long turned to ash. That is what I believe the false rune is, a missing limb of something far older than the Erd tree, older even than the greater will's shaping of the lands between. Something torn apart, scattered, and left to fester. I can still feel it, even now, under my feet, thrumming like a war drum in deep earth. Every so often my vision blurs, and I see shapes in the shadows between bookshelves, half-familiar symbols trying to fit together. I do not know why I was chosen to find it. Perhaps it calls to all who will listen, and I was the first fool to answer. Perhaps my patron already knows, and I am merely another piece being moved into place. The singing stops as I write this. The silence is worse. Then, faint at first, I feel it. A heartbeat, not mine, not even through me, beneath the floor. The tempo quickens. Something is rising, and I know with perfect cold certainty. This is only the first. The night air around Stormvale Castle tastes like iron and forgotten promises. I approached the ancient fortress as the fading light of the dying lands between bled into a bruised sky. The wind howled through fractured battlements, a chorus of lost souls lamenting a kingdom's ruin. It was here, amidst the ruins of Godric the Grafted's domain, that the second great rune awaited. The castle itself seemed alive, an immense organism of stone and rust, its corridors twisting like veins, its halls pulsing with a half-forgotten rhythm. Each step I took echoed as if the fortress still breathed, a slow, measured intake, the subtle creak of armor being worn unseen. The sentry routes, once meticulously patrolled by loyal knights, were now silent, but not empty. Shadows flickered like the last sparks of dying stars. The air was thick with dust, and something else, something metallic and cold, pressing against my skin. The great outer gate groaned as I forced it open. The smell of scorched wood and blackened flesh lingered long after my passage. Above the shattered courtyard, the sky was stained with a heavy dusk, crimson turning to violet. The ground beneath me was a mosaic of shattered bones and rusted weapons, an eerie battlefield frozen in a nightmare's breath. Deep within the castle's heart lay the chamber where Godric's great rune was kept. It rested on a pedestal crafted from the twisted limbs of the dragons he once conquered, encased in a lattice work of gold and iron, an altar to impossible ambition. The rune itself was a jagged shard of unearthly crystal, glowing faintly with a pale, sickly light that shifted as though alive. But it was not its light that unnerved me. It was the sound. A dual resonance hummed beneath the surface, a low, almost imperceptible drone that vibrated in my bones, and a higher, brittle chime, like the clinking of distant chains. At first I thought it was the castle settling, but the rhythm was too precise, too deliberate. I set down the recording instruments, calibrating the spectral sensors. The readings defied logic. The rune emitted two frequencies simultaneously, one audible to my ears, the other resonating in the marrow of my bones. When I placed my gloved hand near its surface, a wave of vertigo seized me, and the shadows in the room seemed to waver, like ink dissolving in water. This was the first true anomaly in my research. The rune did not merely contain a fragment of Godric's fractured grace. It sought connection. It reached outward like a wound, yearning for touch. There was no protocol for this. No precedent in the blessed tomes. I pressed on, making detailed notes. The hum accelerated when exposed to ambient light, and slowed in darkness, as if the rune itself breathed in rhythm with some invisible cycle. Yet the most disturbing moment came when I caught a whisper, a voice that was not quite sound, but a vibration felt only in the sinews of my mind. It was speaking in old tongue, uttering a single phrase over and over. Grafted, grafted, grafted. The word sank into me like a blade, stirring a primal dread I had never known. Godric was a monster born of twisted flesh and ambition. His rune, I realized, was no mere relic. It was a curse given form, an echo of his endless hunger to graft and reshape his own being. The rune's power was not a gift, but a contagion. I could feel it probing me, seeking to graft itself onto my soul. For a moment my thoughts scrambled. Was I still myself, or a vessel waiting to be claimed? I broke contact and staggered back, breath shallow, heart pounding. Outside the chamber, the corridors whispered in the darkness, their voices indistinct but endless. The castle seemed to pulse in time with the rune's heartbeat, an omnipresent reminder of the price paid for power. As I prepared to leave, I felt a sudden weight upon my shoulder. A brief glance revealed nothing but the shifting shadows. Yet when I turned, fully, the great gate behind me slammed shut with the force of a titan's fist. Trapped. My comms crackled alive, an urgent voice from an unknown source. Extraction is delayed. Reinforcements are diverted. The castle is sealed. The military terms were clinical, detached, but beneath the words was a current of fear. The castle had not just closed its doors, it had declared war. I cursed under my breath and moved to find another exit, following the rune's hum like a beacon. It grew louder in the depths of the castle, a crescendo that vibrated through the bones of the earth. The chamber walls began to shimmer, the air thickening as if saturated with unseen energy. I could feel the rune's presence grafting itself into my very senses. My heartbeat matched its eerie dual tones, a rhythm impossible to distinguish from my own. Then came the moment I can neither explain nor understand fully. Time fractured. A shard of reality slipped. The shadows elongated and folded like a broken mirror. I glimpsed a figure at the edge of my vision. A man with Godric's face, stitched together with the faces of his victims, walking silently alongside me, unseen and yet intimately close. I blinked, and the figure was gone. When I regained full awareness, I found myself outside the castle, alone under a sullen sky. Hours had vanished. My instruments recorded no passage through the walls, no signals, no footsteps. Yet I bore a mark, an unfamiliar graft beneath my skin, a jagged scar pulsing with the same dual resonance as the rune. I do not know what claimed me within Stormvale's walls, but I know this. The rune is no longer bound to the fortress. It travels with me, a silent parasite, waiting for the moment to graft anew. And as I write this, the dual hum grows louder still, beating in my veins. The shard of Stormvale is alive, and it is hungry. The Academy of Raya Lucaria lies cloaked beneath a cold, unyielding sky, its spires piercing the mists of Liornia's endless lakes like bones thrust from drowned earth. I approached not by the grand, wrought gates, long abandoned and choked with rot, but through a forgotten drainage sluice carved beneath the waterline. The scent of algae and stagnant water pressed into my nostrils as I slipped beneath the archway, the chill damp biting at my skin like a silent predator. The water here was unnerving, still but alive, rippling in patterns that seemed at odds with the slightest breeze. It pulsed, as if breathing beneath the surface, and faint phosphorescence glowed deep where no light should reach. My objective was Renala's great rune, housed, so the records claim, in a sphere suspended within the Academy's deepest archives. But the surface world had long since forgotten the true nature of this place. I could hear the Academy's last vestiges, half-whispered incantations, the scratching of chalk against blackboards, the rustling of pages, echoing in the drowned halls. I waded through knee-deep water until I found the submerged chamber, a hollow orb of glass and enchanted crystal. The rune hovered there, rotating slowly, too slowly. Its reflection lagged behind its movement by several seconds, like a dream struggling to keep pace with waking. This delay was not merely an oddity, but a symptom of something profoundly wrong. The rune bent time itself, binding false memories into the minds of those who dared to linger. I watched my own reflection in the sphere's surface, and for a moment it fractured. Another image flickered, a memory not my own. I saw a war I had never fought, under a moon that never rose. I felt the sting of arrows, the cold kiss of death, the hopeless rage of a soldier swallowed by shadow. I blinked, and the vision was gone. The chamber was silent again, save for the faint drip of water and the distant sound of litanies, half muttered in a tongue I could no longer place. The sphere pulsed softly, each rotation tracing an invisible sigil of power. Among the shifting symbols, I noticed a pattern that unnerved me deeply, a repeating glyph that matched the strange, bleeding rune I had first encountered beneath Leyndell. Was it possible the false rune's influence was reaching here, weaving its corruption into even the most sacred sanctums? I took a cautious step back, but the water beneath my feet rippled once more, this time flowing upward, defying gravity. My breath caught. The walls seemed to close in, warped and bending, as though reality itself were bending to the rune's will. I forced myself to steady my breath and catalogue every anomaly. The Academy's laws of physics, etched in ancient ordinances, were unraveling. Time was fractured. Water no longer obeyed gravity. Memories were mutable. These were not merely symptoms, but the very edges of a rupture, a fracture in the fabric of the lands between. My instruments whirred softly, struggling to calibrate. I recorded everything: spectral distortions, ambient temperature shifts, the rise of humidity heavy with spores from long-dead blooms. The rune itself thrummed with a resonance that drew my gaze again and again, pulling me toward a hunger I barely understood. I sensed an unseen presence, an echo of Renala herself, or something that wore her shape like a mask. It whispered prayers and curses intertwined, litanies designed to anchor the restless dead to a dream that was never theirs. A sudden pulse of energy flared from the sphere, and I was thrown to my knees, ears ringing. When I looked up, the sphere's reflection had changed. Now, it showed the Academy in ruin, the spires shattered and submerged, the lake waters swirling in a violent storm beneath an inverted sun. I tried to rise, but the water around me churned as though alive. I tasted salt and rust, the choking scent of decay. My vision blurred, and for a fleeting instant, I saw the false rune's bleeding edges cutting through the surface of the water. When I regained composure, the chamber was silent and still. The sphere spun steadily once more, as if nothing had occurred. I withdrew slowly, aware that each step might carry the rune's influence deeper into my mind. Outside, the mists had thickened into a suffocating pall. The sun had vanished, swallowed by a dark shroud that felt unnatural, as though the false rune's shadow stretched far beyond its hidden chamber. As I prepared to leave the Academy's depths, a tremor rippled through the water beneath my feet. The flow reversed once again, this time stronger, pulling me backward toward the flooded archives. I resisted with all my strength, but the current tugged at me, whispering promises of knowledge and power. Then, from the murky depths, a voice reached me, soft, coaxing, and filled with sorrow. Come, remember what was lost, become whole. I broke free from the water's grip, scrambling onto dry land. My instruments recorded a final, chilling note. The ambient temperature had dropped sharply, and the water's resonance now matched the pulse of the false rune in my blood. The false rune is no longer confined to a single place. It is spreading, woven into the very fabric of the lands between, its influence creeping like rot beneath the surface of all things. I do not know how to stop it, but I must try. The land of Caelid lies beneath a sickly sky, the horizon smeared with ash and blood. I crossed the scarred plains towards the bridge that leads to Redmane Castle, home to Radan's great rune. The air was thick with the stench of rot and burnt iron, and a suffocating red mist hovered low, swirling like a living thing. The bridge itself was a monument to ruin. Once a proud archway of stone and steel, now fractured and crumbling, it stretched across a chasm that seemed bottomless. The ground beneath pulsed faintly with a warped resonance, as if the earth itself had been wounded, still bleeding invisible waves of energy. The sky was alive with ash, drifting down in slow, deliberate flakes, settling on my armor and seeping into every crevice. The ash did not fall in random patterns. It moved with purpose, drifting in spirals and concentric circles, tracing impossible geometries that defied Euclidean logic. I stepped onto the bridge, each footfall swallowed by the thick red mist. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant echo of battle drums, deep, rhythmic, and unyielding. It was a sound out of place in a land so broken, yet it pulled at the very marrow of my bones. Radan's great rune awaited at the bridge's terminus, suspended within a pillar of pale fire that burned without heat or smoke. The rune's surface shimmered with a storm of fractured light, flashing in irregular bursts like lightning caught inside crystal. When I reached out to touch it, the rune's power surged through me, and I felt time itself bend around my body. The world slowed. Arrows hung frozen mid-flight, their shafts tipped with crimson light. A burning arrow hovered before me, quivering, its flame refusing to consume. The gravity of the place shifted. My weight seemed to waver between heaviness and weightlessness. The blood of long-dead warriors rose in droplets around me, orbiting my limbs like tiny moons before dissolving into ash. I realized then that Radan's great rune did not simply grant strength. It commanded the very flow of time and gravity in its vicinity. It was a relic of war, a testament to a battlefield where laws of physics had been rewritten in blood and fire. Telemetry readings confirmed what my senses screamed. Localized gravitational fields fluctuated wildly. Time dilation warped perception, and spatial coordinates bent as if the bridge itself were a fragment of a shattered dimension. Yet the most harrowing effect was psychological. My mind fractured, split between present awareness and an impossible simultaneity of moments, visions of Radan's last stand, screams of fallen soldiers, and the hollow silence of the aftermath all played out behind my eyes at once. The duality of the rune's power echoed the fragmented nature of the lands between itself, fractured, bleeding, but still stubbornly alive. As I prepared to leave, the distant drums grew louder, now accompanied by faint voices chanting in an ancient tongue. The mist thickened, and the ash coalesced into shapes, phantoms of soldiers frozen mid-charge, their eyes empty sockets glowing with unholy light. I felt the weight of their gaze, accusatory and eternal. Suddenly, an arrow released from the mist, its flaming tip aimed straight for my heart. Time slowed. The projectile halted in midair, spinning slowly like a cruel jewel. For a heartbeat, I was suspended in a moment outside of time, the arrow inches from my chest. Then it turned, not toward me, but away, spiraling upward into the ashen sky. The bridge trembled beneath my feet. Stones shifted and floated, dislodging in slow motion, creating an impossible dance of debris suspended between gravity and void. I retreated, heart pounding as the spatial distortions rippled outward, threatening to consume the bridge whole. Before I crossed back into the relative safety of the barren plains, my comms crackled. An emergency update. Containment breach reported. Temporal flux detected. Evacuation orders delayed. Stay clear of Redmayne Castle. The cold efficiency of military jargon could not mask the fear underlying the message. The great rune was not just a relic, it was a ticking wound in reality. As I moved away, I felt the dual pulse of the false rune intensify within me, synchronized now with Radan's own fractured heartbeat. The bridge of unmoored ash was no longer merely a crossing. It was a gateway, and the gates were opening. The giant's mountain tops rise like fractured spires clawing at the dull, cold sky. Here, the air is thin and bitter, each breath a razor slicing through my lungs. I approached the tower without doors, not recorded in any official ledger, hidden beneath layers of forgotten ordinances and prayers whispered in defiance of the Golden Order. The ascent was a penitential rite. Every step was measured, every footfall a whispered prayer. The tower's silhouette loomed, shrouded in pale clouds, an impossible geometry that seemed to shift as I gazed. The walls bore the weight of countless litanies, etched deep into stone and flesh alike, prayers for absolution, curses against falsehood, hymns to forgotten saints. Morgoth's great rune waited inside, concealed beyond the reach of the faithful. Unlike the others, it did not gleam or burn. It was silent, except for one cruel truth. It ignites only when the bearer lies. The great door I found was no door at all, but a flat, seamless wall of stone. No handle, no keyhole, no symbol to mark passage. It stood as a challenge, a riddle carved in shadow. I spoke the prayers I had learned, voices low and steady, but the wall remained impenetrable. I circled, seeking another way in. The tower's surface rippled, the stone flowing like water beneath my gaze. It was a trap for the mind as much as the body. My instruments recorded a strange distortion in the ambient air, as if the laws of physics bent to accommodate the rune's will. Suddenly, the wall pulsed and parted, a wound in the tower's flesh. I stepped through into the hollow silence within. The chamber was vast but oppressively empty. The floor was tiled in black and white, an endless chessboard on which truths and lies were played for mortal stakes. The rune lay at the center, a dark crystal embedded in the floor, its surface smooth and unyielding. I knelt before it, noting the inscriptions around its base. They were litanies to verity, promises made and broken, oaths that bound and shattered. The rune shimmered faintly, a candle's flicker in a suffocating gloom. I tested it with words, statements of fact and falsehood. Each lie ignited the rune's glow, sending ripples through the chamber's air. The warmth was sharp, like the sting of fire on bare skin. Truths left it cold, the crystal retreating into silence. This was no mere relic. It was a mirror of the soul's fracture, a judge that consumed duplicity and left nothing but ash. The weight of its presence bore down on me. I could feel my own thoughts unraveling, the secrets I had buried, the half-truths I told myself to endure this path. The rune seemed to reach inside me, testing the limits of my resolve. The chamber's silence was broken by a sudden sound, a breath not my own, slow and deliberate. I turned, heart pounding, but saw only shifting shadows. The stone walls seemed to lean closer, the air thickening with unspoken accusations. I realized then the rune was not only a detector but a corrupter. Each lie fed its fire. Each denial of truth strengthened its hold. It whispered promises of relief, a final absolution from the burdens I carried. I fought the urge to speak falsehoods, to escape the growing flame. But in that moment, a whisper slid into my mind, a voice like silk and steel. "Speak and be free." I resisted. I repeated the litanies I had learned, anchoring myself in duty and truth. The rune's glow dimmed, retreating into shadows. But the damage was done. My breath was not entirely my own. The rune had marked me, a stain beneath my skin that pulsed with the rhythm of half-truths. I felt its power grafting itself into my being, rewriting oaths I had sworn to the Golden Order. The tower without doors offered no escape, not for the body, not for the soul. I fled into the cold mountain air, lungs burning, mind fragmented. The path back was a gauntlet of shifting stone and whispered secrets. As I descended, I caught sight of a sigil carved deep into the tower's base, an inverted spiral, its center bleeding dark light. The symbol matched the one I had seen beneath Lanedell, and in the Academy's sphere. The false rune's reach was expanding, threading itself through the very fabric of the lands between sacred relics. The tower without doors was a prison, a trial, and a curse. And Morgoth's great rune was its executioner. The Black Knife catacombs lie beneath the ruined city of Nokron, a labyrinth of cold stone and darker secrets. I descended into their depths by a stairway carved from obsidian that seemed to drink the faint light, swallowing it whole. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the scent of damp earth, ancient dust, and something metallic, like blood long dried, but never forgotten. The catacombs are a tomb, not only for the dead, but for the boundaries of reason. The walls were carved with sigils that writhe and shift beneath the eye's gaze, as if the stones themselves were alive, pulsing with a rhythm only the soul could hear. The deeper I ventured, the heavier the air became, thick with a resonance that pressed into my chest like a vice. At the heart of the catacombs rests the Black Knife's great rune, an obsidian shard of impossible sharpness, embedded in a pedestal covered in fractured glyphs that seem to crawl and split under inspection. Unlike the other runes, this one does not glow or hum. It absorbs light, seeming to erase presence itself. My instruments flickered erratically near the rune, as if struggling to anchor in a void beyond sensing. The temperature plummeted, the air turning brittle and sharp as shattered glass. Breath crystallized in the frigid darkness, and my skin prickled with static, the telltale sign of a warp-tainted field. I reached out with gloved fingers, and the cold sank through the armor, biting into bone and marrow. A low, almost imperceptible vibration thrummed through the stone, a heartbeat out of sync with reality, slow and deliberate. The rune spoke without sound, weaving a language of absence and void, a negation that gnawed at the edges of perception. I felt my memories fragment, moments slipping away like sand through clenched fists, faces blurred, names vanished, and a creeping emptiness spread through my thoughts. Time and identity faltered beneath the black knife's shadow. It was not just a relic, but an erasure, a wound in existence itself. As I documented these horrors, the catacombs seemed to shift around me, passages twisting impossibly, walls closing in and receding, a labyrinth reshaping itself in response to my presence. The glyphs on the walls flickered, their meanings unraveling and reforming in an endless cycle of decay and rebirth. I heard whispers, voices layered over each other in a cacophony of betrayal and despair. The words were indistinct, but heavy with accusation. Suddenly, the air thickened further, and the rune pulsed, sending ripples through the catacombs' dark veins. A shadow detached itself from the walls, a figure clad in the black garb of the night assassins, but its eyes were voids, infinite and cold. It moved without sound, a spectre of forgotten sins and silent executions. I raised my weapon, but it passed through the apparition, as if I were air. The figure reached out, and a chill like the grave wrapped around my heart. I staggered back, gasping, as the rune's pulse synchronized with my faltering heartbeat. The shadows deepened, folding into each other, erasing the boundary between self and void. I realized then the black knife's great rune was not just a fragment of power. It was a fragment of annihilation. It promised release from pain through oblivion, a final cut severing all ties to suffering and memory. Yet the cost was total erasure. I struggled to retreat, the catacombs twisting in maddening geometry, corridors folding back into themselves, trapping me in a labyrinth that denied escape. As I fled, I glimpsed carved reliefs, scenes of shadowy figures plunging knives into unseen foes, faces contorted in silent screams, and a final panel depicting a blade slicing through a shattered rune. The false rune's bleeding sigil was etched beneath the blade, binding annihilation to corruption. My comms crackled with a garbled warning. Containment compromised. Mental degradation detected. Extraction impossible. The voice was faint, distorted, perhaps a reflection of the rune's erasing influence. I staggered out into the cold night air, breath ragged, mind fraying. The Black Knife catacombs had tested me, carved into my soul, an emptiness I fear will never heal. And still, the false rune's pulse thrums beneath my skin, an echo of oblivion awaiting its final cut. The halls of the Knight's Cavalry fortress lay drowned in shadows, an oppressive silence broken only by the distant clatter of iron hooves long stilled. I entered the sanctum of the Betrayer's rune, a place whispered of in fractured prayers and silenced confessions. The air was thick with the scent of burning wax and rusting steel, mingling in a miasma that clung to my skin like a funeral shroud. This rune was unlike any before, a sigil carved into a blade of blackened steel, its edge chipped and dulled from untold betrayals. It pulsed with a cold, rhythmic beat, like a heart that refused to die despite its wounds. The rune's curse was clear: silence. No sound passed through the chamber, not a breath, not a whisper. Even my own heartbeat was muffled, swallowed by the void that clung to the rune like a shroud. The absence of noise was a presence itself, oppressive, suffocating, a void that gnawed at the edges of sanity. I reached out, gloved fingers trembling. The steel was cold beyond reason, biting into flesh beneath the armor. The rune's pulse quickened, syncing with the beat of my own heart. Or so I thought. Time warped again. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes collapsed into a moment. The silence deepened, and I found myself unable to recall the simplest truths. Names slipped away. Memories frayed. The rune fed on betrayal, on silence forced and chosen. It was the echo of lies unspoken, of truths buried beneath oath and steel. Voices rose in the distance, ghostly, fragmented, snatches of confessions and regrets. I could not tell if they were real or phantoms conjured by the rune's curse. A sharp coldness ran down my spine as I realized the rune's power was not only to silence, but to isolate. It severed bonds between comrades, between past and present, between thought and expression. The chamber walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening until I was swallowed by darkness. In that void, a whisper came, soft, insidious. Betray. Be silent. Become free. I resisted, clinging to the fragile thread of my identity. The rune's pulse slowed, then stopped, but the silence remained. Outside, the fortress groaned as if mourning. My instruments recorded a sudden spike in psychic resonance, a wave of sorrow and rage that pulsed through the air like a funeral toll. I staggered away from the chamber, the weight of silence heavy on my soul. The rune's mark burned beneath my skin, a faint scar that pulsed with every heartbeat. As I exited the fortress, a distant cry shattered the stillness. An anguished howl carried on the wind, echoing the betrayer's own torment. The silence had been broken. The Cathedral of the Twin Flames stood as a shattered monument to forgotten faith, its stained glass windows cracked, and weeping filaments of colored light that pooled like blood on the marble floor. I entered its vaulted nave, my footsteps swallowed by a silence thick enough to suffocate. The air was charged, laden with incense, ash, and the faintest undertone of something else, something older and more malignant. Here lay the locus of the false rune's creeping corruption, the fractured liturgy, a ritual once pure, but now twisted beyond recognition. The priests who once chanted here had vanished, their voices absorbed by the void left behind. The altar was a shattered relic of obsidian and bone, carved with sigils that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. Upon it rested a tome bound in flesh and sinew, the pages inscribed, with prayers that twisted and writhed as I read them. The words changed with each glance, a litany of blessings turned curses, hymns that promised salvation, but whispered damnation. As I opened the tome, a cold wind swept through the cathedral, extinguishing candles and stirring the dust into swirling eddies. The air thickened, vibrating with the echo of 1,000 unspoken prayers, each a fragment of a liturgy, torn apart and reassembled in blasphemy. The false rune's influence was undeniable here, warping the sacred into the profane. I felt the edges of my mind fray, as if the very act of understanding threatened to unravel me. The liturgy was a mirror reflecting the corruption spreading through the lands between, fractured, incomplete, yet terrifyingly whole in its brokenness. I traced the rune's sigil woven into the altar's carvings, a spiral bleeding into itself, endless and unresolved. This symbol echoed the sigils I had seen before, each an iteration of the false rune's relentless march. Then came the chant, soft at first, barely more than a breath, yet growing steadily into a chorus of voices both human and something else. The sound layered upon itself, dissonant and harmonious, weaving a tapestry of sound that pierced the soul. I found myself reciting fragments of the liturgy involuntarily, words alien and yet hauntingly familiar. Each phrase opened a crack in reality. Shadows spilled from the fissures, coalescing into forms that danced just beyond the edge of perception. The cathedral's walls shuddered, and the stained glass fractured further, casting prismatic shards of light that twisted into grotesque shapes. The air grew colder still, the scent of burning flesh mingling with the incense. Amid the chaos, a figure appeared, a priestess clad in tatters, her eyes glowing with an unholy light. She raised a hand, beckoning me closer with a crooked finger. Her voice was a whisper that carried across the void. The liturgy is broken, but the song remains. Sing with us, or be silenced forever. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, as the cathedral dissolved into shadow and sound. The last thing I saw was the false rune's sigil bleeding across the altar, pulsing with a dark hunger. My instruments recorded a final spike in psychic resonance before going silent. The fractured liturgy was no longer a prayer, but a summons, a ritual rewritten by the false rune to herald its dominion. And I was caught within its verses. The ruins of the false throne lay beyond the reach of maps and reason, buried beneath the ash-choked skies of a land forgotten by time. I approached the desolate throne room, its pillars shattered, the floor cracked and scorched by some ancient, unspeakable power. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of sulfur and decay, and a low hum vibrated through the stones, like the heartbeat of a dying god. This was the heart of the false rune's dominion, the place where its corrupted power had been forged and twisted into a weapon against reality itself. The throne, a massive slab of black stone veined with glowing crimson fractures, pulsed with a terrible light that seemed to drink the shadows around it. I stepped forward cautiously, the weight of countless lost souls pressing down upon me. The echoes of betrayal and broken oaths whispered through the ruins, a litany of despair that clawed at the edges of my mind. At the center of the throne, embedded deep within its heart, was the false rune itself, a jagged shard of crystal, bleeding light and darkness in equal measure. It resonated with a duality that defied comprehension, a cosmic dance of creation and destruction, bound in eternal conflict. As I reached out to touch it, visions flooded my mind, images of the lands between shattered, kingdoms burning, and the great runes twisted into grotesque parodies of their former glory. I saw the false god who had once claimed this throne, a being of both light and shadow, whose betrayal had birthed this endless corruption. The rune's voice echoed in my thoughts, an endless litany of promises and threats, binding and breaking all at once. I am the end and the beginning, the fracture in the light, the shadow in the flame. The ruins trembled, and the air thickened as the false god's presence pressed against the veil of reality. Time fractured once more, and I glimpsed futures that could not be, memories that never were, and the terrible inevitability of all things undone. My instruments recorded a surge of psychic energy, the echoes of a war beyond mortal understanding. The false rune was not merely a fragment of power. It was a curse upon the very fabric of existence, a wound that festered and spread with every passing moment. As I withdrew, the throne's light flared, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping hands. The dual resonance thrummed in my veins, a constant reminder that I was now bound to this blight. The false rune's dominion was not confined to one place or time. It was a plague, an infection in the soul of the lands between, and I was its unwilling carrier. The world outside had grown dimmer, the lands between folding in on themselves, like a dying star collapsing into darkness. I stood beneath a sky smeared with bruised clouds, and a sun bleeding its last light, the faintest ember in a world consumed by shadow. My own reflection was a stranger's, a tarnished marked by the false rune's corruption, a vessel carrying a burden that neither flesh nor spirit could shed. Every step I took echoed with the weight of 1,000 broken promises and fading hopes. The rune pulsed beneath my skin, a slow, relentless heartbeat, syncing with my own. It was a tether to a darkness that threatened to consume all light, a reminder that I was no longer merely a witness, but a participant in the unraveling of all things. Around me, the lands whispered in agony, winds carrying the cries of lost warriors, the rustling of withered leaves, the distant clang of broken blades. The once proud kingdoms lay fractured and bleeding, their glory twisted into shadowed remnants of a forgotten age. I found myself at the edge of a crumbling precipice, looking out over the broken world. The horizon was a jagged scar, and the air tasted of ash and regret. The false rune's influence warped the very air, bending light and shadow, until reality became a fractured mosaic. Memories flooded my mind, echoes of battles fought, friendships shattered, and oaths broken. Each was a shard of a shattered soul, a testament to the cost of defiance and the price of survival. Yet amidst the ruin, a faint spark remained, a last light flickering stubbornly against the encroaching dark. It was fragile and fleeting, but it was enough. I gripped my weapon tightly, feeling the cold steel bite into my palms. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers both seen and unseen. The false rune's corruption spread like a disease, consuming all it touched. But I would not succumb. The tarnished are not merely victims of fate, but its challengers. Even as the darkness grows, we carry within us the last light of hope, a flame that refuses to be extinguished. As I turned away from the precipice, the rune pulsed sharply. A warning or a call, I could not tell. The road ahead was shrouded in shadow, but I would walk it nonetheless. For in this fractured world, to stand and fight is the only true defiance. The ruined sanctum lay deep within the forgotten vale, a place where even the shadows dared not linger. Here, the final covenant was broken, a pact forged in blood and light, now shattered by the insidious corruption of the false rune. I entered the chamber with cautious steps, the air thick with the scent of burnt incense and spilled blood, mingling in a toxic haze that clung to the ancient stone. The walls bore the scars of countless rituals, etched runes faded and cracked, their meanings twisted beyond recognition. At the center stood the altar of vows, once a beacon of sacred promise, now a desecrated relic dripping with shadowed ichor. The false rune hovered above it, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to mock the beating of a broken heart. The covenant had been a binding of souls, a sacred trust between the tarnished and the grace of the Elden Ring itself. But now, the rune's corruption had seeped into its foundation, fracturing the bond and sowing discord among the faithful. I traced my fingers along the altar's edge, feeling the vibrations of the shattered covenant resonate through my bones. Whispers echoed in the void, pleas for mercy, accusations of betrayal, promises undone. The chamber began to warp, walls bending and twisting, as if reality itself rejected the desecration. Shadows lengthened, coalescing into forms both monstrous and familiar. Faces of fallen comrades flickered in the gloom, their eyes hollow and accusing. I understood then the true cost of the false rune's spread. Not just the corruption of power, but the destruction of trust and unity. Without the covenant, the lands between would fracture irreparably, torn apart by suspicion and despair. A sudden tremor shook the chamber, and the rune flared with blinding light. The air cracked like thunder, and I was thrown to my knees, ears ringing with the cries of 1,000 broken souls. As the light faded, I saw the altar cracked open, revealing a hidden chamber beneath. Within lay relics of the old faith, fragments of the Elden Ring, shattered, but still pulsing faintly with dormant power. The false sigil, the bleeding spiral, was etched deeply into their surfaces. I reached out, knowing that touching them might bind me further to the rune's curse, but also that they held the key to salvation or destruction. The chamber darkened, and a voice, ancient and terrible, whispered from the shadows. "Choose, tarnished, salvation or oblivion." The air hung heavy with a palpable dread as I descended into the depths beneath the shattered altar, where the fractured fragments of the Elden Ring lay cradled in a basin of cracked stone. The chamber was a tomb of silence and shadow, its walls inscribed with litanies of hope, twisted into curses. Every breath I drew was thick with the metallic tang of ancient blood and the cold whisper of forgotten prayers. The false rune pulsed in resonance with the shards, each beat sending ripples through the darkness like waves breaking upon a fractured shore. The very fabric of reality here was stretched thin, torn between salvation and oblivion, a precipice upon which the fate of the lands between balanced precariously. I knelt before the fragments, their fractured surfaces glowing faintly with a light both pure and corrupted. Touching them was to touch the heart of a broken covenant, to feel the pain of a grace lost, but still yearning for redemption. The chamber seemed to breathe, the shadows shifting as a voice, low and sonorous, echoed from the void. The false rune is both wound and blade, cleaving truth from lies, light from shadow. To wield it is to carry the burden of endless fracture. I felt the rune's power surge through me, a torrent of contradiction, creation and destruction intertwined in a dance older than time. The shards called to me, promising salvation through sacrifice, an end to the eternal fracture. But the cost was clear. To heal the lands between, the curse had to be embraced and then severed. By a benediction written in blood and tears, rising, I lifted the fragments, their weight both unbearable and necessary. The chamber quaked, stones splitting, and ash swirling in a cyclone of forgotten memories. The final liturgy began, a fractured chant woven from the remnants of the old faith and the dark power of the false rune. Voices long silenced joined in, a choir of ghosts and shadows lifting the benediction toward the fractured sky. The rune's pulse quickened, echoing the rhythm of my heartbeat and the desperate prayers of the lands between. Light and darkness collided in a tempest of raw power as the benediction reached its crescendo. Reality trembled, torn between ruin and rebirth. The shards dissolved into a radiant cascade, weaving a fragile thread of unity through the splintered realms. But the price was paid in blood. The rune branded itself upon my flesh, a scar glowing faintly beneath the skin, a mark of both salvation and eternal torment. As the chamber fell silent, I knew the fracture was not fully healed. The curse lingered, a shadow cast long and deep across the lands between. The final benediction had been given, but its echo would haunt the ages. The light had returned, but it was a fragile thing, pale and trembling beneath an ashen sky. I walked through the lands between, now scarred but not shattered, the earth still humming faintly with the aftershocks of the final benediction. The false rune's mark burned beneath my skin, a constant reminder that the fracture remained, even if held at bay. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone and burnt incense, a lingering echo of the cathedral's fractured liturgy. Shadows clung to corners and crevices, whispering in voices that were almost memories, half-remembered prayers and forgotten sins. I saw the remnants of the fallen, warriors and saints alike, their eyes hollow, their forms twisted by the lingering corruption. Some wandered aimlessly, lost between worlds, while others stood silent sentinels over graves unmarked and forgotten. Everywhere I went, the false sigil appeared, etched in blood upon stone, carved into twisted roots, and whispered in the rustling of dead leaves. It was a constant, a reminder that the curse was not vanquished, but contained, like a wound bound tight yet still bleeding beneath the surface. The rune's pulse was slower now, a heartbeat measured and steady, but I knew it would awaken again. The fracture was a cycle, a litany without end, and I was its reluctant bearer. I reached a ruined village where the wind carried faint echoes of laughter and sorrow. Ghosts of lives interrupted, stories untold. The land seemed to hold its breath, caught between remembrance and oblivion. Here I laid down the final pieces of the shattered covenant, a silent vow to guard the fragile peace and to bear the burden of the rune's curse alone. As night fell, the stars blinked uncertainly above. Their light filtered through the ash and shadow. The final benediction had woven a fragile thread of hope, but the darkness lingered, waiting patiently for the day it could unravel all again. I stood alone beneath the void-torn sky, the weight of the rune pressing heavy on my soul. The fracture remains, and so do I. The cold wind whispered through the ruins of the ancient sanctuary, carrying with it the hollow echoes of a covenant once sacred, now fractured and silent. I stood alone amid broken pillars and shattered relics, the air heavy with the scent of damp, stone and faded prayers. The sky above was a roiling canvas of ash and shadow, a grim testament to the fragile peace I bore on my shoulders. The false rune's mark burned beneath my flesh, a quiet, relentless pulse that tethered me to a fate I neither sought nor could escape. It was a chain forged not of metal, but of memory and silence, binding me to the curse and the covenant that now existed only in whispers. I traced my fingers along the cracked walls, where sigils faded into nothingness, their meanings lost to time and corruption. This place had been a sanctuary, a bastion against the darkness, but the fracture had seeped deep, unraveling faith and hope alike. The silence here was a presence, a suffocating stillness that pressed upon my mind, unraveling thought and memory with every breath. It was the silence of the betrayer's rune, amplified and eternal, a void that swallowed sound and spirit alike. In the distance, the faintest flicker of light stirred, a single candle burning in defiance of the darkness. It was fragile, a beacon in a sea of shadow, yet it held a promise, that even in silence the covenant endured. I knelt before the candle, whispering a litany of forgotten names and lost vows, my voice a fragile thread woven into the tapestry of night. The rune pulsed beneath my skin, a reminder that the burden of this silent covenant was mine alone to bear. As the candle flickered and dimmed, I felt the weight of countless eyes, ghostly, unseen, watching, waiting. The covenant was not broken, only changed. It endured in silence, a solemn oath etched in shadow and blood. The cold wind stirred once more, carrying with it a final whisper, faint and distant. Watch. Wait. Endure. The night sky above the lands between was torn, riven by fractures that bled void and starlight, a cosmic wound slowly widening beyond mortal reckoning. I stood alone on the precipice of oblivion, the weight of the false rune branded beneath my flesh, its pulse a cruel metronome marking time until the end or the next beginning. Around me, the world shifted in impossible ways. Shadows stretched and bent, folding back upon themselves in recursive patterns that defied reason. The very air whispered secrets older than the stars, voices like silk and shards, singing of endless cycles of ruin and rebirth. The final benediction had staved off the collapse, fragile as a candle in a storm, but the fracture remained, an open wound in the soul of creation. The false rune's corruption was not confined to the lands between. It was a contagion spreading through the fabric of reality, an infection waiting patiently to consume all. I felt it crawling beneath the surface of dreams, twisting the light of distant stars, seeping into the hearts of gods and mortals alike. The rune's reach was infinite, a scar across existence itself. The echoes of the shattered covenant still haunted me, ghosts of hope and despair intertwined, their voices rising in a litany of warning and lament. This is the cycle. This is the fracture. This is the end and the beginning. I looked to the horizon, where the skies burned with unnatural fire, and the stars winked out one by one, swallowed by darkness. The lands groaned beneath the weight of unseen forces, and the false sigil bled anew, marking the earth with its endless spiral. I was no longer just a bearer of the curse. I was its vessel, its herald. The false rune pulsed beneath my skin, a beacon to the void that awaited. Yet, in the heart of the fracture, a faint spark endured, a stubborn defiance etched in bone and blood. It was not enough to banish the darkness, but it was enough to hold the line. The fracture would spread, the cycle would continue, and I would carry its burden into the endless night. The stars above flickered once more, dimming, returning, flickering. Never still, never whole. The lands between was a wound that would never heal, and I was the scar it bore.